The air in Boise always had a certain sharpness to it, a crisp, pine-scented edge that reminded me of the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Mountains. It was a beautiful state, rugged and unforgiving, much like the people who raised me. But today, standing behind the heavy oak doors of the Boise Center, the cold wasn't coming from the Idaho wind. It was coming from within. I adjusted the lapel of my charcoal blazer, feeling the cool silk against my skin. 10 years. It had been 10 long, silent years since I last stood in the same room as Gerald and Martha Joan. In that decade, I had rebuilt myself from the literal dirt of our family ranch into a woman they wouldn't just fail to recognize, they would be forced to respect. I looked at my reflection in the polished brass of the door handle. My hair, once kept in a messy, practical braid to keep it out of the dishwater and the dirt, was now a sharp, professional cut. My hand, which used to be raw and cracked from scrubbing floors and lifting my father's dead weight in and out of his bed, were now manicured and steady. I was Dr. Blanche Joan, the keynote speaker for the Northwest Rural Healthcare Initiative. I was the woman who had secured $20 million in grants to revolutionize medical access in the very remote corners of Idaho that my parents had tried to bury me in. Through the gap in the doors, I could hear the hum of the crowd. 300 people, politicians, hospital board members, and local donors. And there, in the fourth row, were the architects of my misery. My father looked smaller than I remembered. The back injury he had used as a leash to keep me bound to his bedside for 3 years had clearly taken a genuine toll now. He sat slumped in his chair, a cane resting against his knee. Beside him, my mother was fussing with her purse, her face a map of bitter lines and faded pride. They looked ordinary. That was the most shocking part. These monsters who had intercepted my mail, stolen my future, and treated me like a piece of inherited property. They just looked like two elderly people waiting for a lecture. They were here because they were desperate. I knew from the local grapevine that their ranch was failing, and my father's health was finally, truly declining. They had come to this summit to lobby for a specialized home care pilot program, a program that I personally oversaw. They had come to beg for the very service they once forced me to provide for free. And the irony? They had no idea that the prestigious director they were so eager to meet was the same daughter they had called unambitious and disloyal before throwing her out into a winter storm. I took a deep, steadying breath. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with a slow, rhythmic finality. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed up until 2 a.m. studying by the light of a single candle after spending 14 hours doing the labor of 3 people. I thought about the weight of the silence in that house, a silence that was only ever broken by their demands or their calculated guilt. "You're so lucky to have a family that needs you, Blanche," my mother used to say, her voice dripping with that toxic Idaho brand of filial duty. "Your brother is out there making a name for himself. Someone has to stay behind and do the real work. Someone has to be the heart of this home." The heart, that was their favorite word, for servant. I remembered the day the silence changed. The day I realized the mail hadn't just been lost in the rural delivery system. I remembered the feeling of the floor falling away from beneath my feet when I found that hidden acceptance letter from the university, crimpled, yellowing, and tucked behind my father's medication logs. It had been sitting there for months. They had watched me cry over my rejection. They had watched me give up on my dreams and settle back into the role of their unpaid caregiver, all while they held the key to my cage in a locked drawer. But that story? That's for later. Today is about the payoff. Today is about the moment the facade of their perfect family shatters under the weight of the truth. The moderator stepped to the podium, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a woman who has dedicated her life to ensuring that no one, regardless of how remote their home may be, is ever left behind or forgotten. Please welcome Dr. Blanche Joan." The applause erupted, a thunderous sound that filled the hall. I pushed the doors open, The light hit me, blinding and white. But I didn't flinch. I walked toward the stage with measured, confident steps. My heels clicked against the floor, a sharp, percussive sound that felt like a countdown. As I reached the stairs, I glanced at row 4. I saw the moment it happened. My mother's hand froze mid-clap. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes widening as she squinted through her spectacles. I saw her lean over and clutch my father's arm, clutching it so hard I could see her knuckles turn white, just like the bruises Irina's mother had left in that ER. My father's head jerked up. He reached for his glasses, sliding them onto his nose with trembling fingers. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I climbed the stairs, shook the moderator's hand, and stepped behind the podium. From this height, the world looked different. They looked different. Down there, they were small. They were the ones waiting for a word. They were the ones hoping for a lifeline. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I saw the shock turn into a flicker of hope, a sickening, opportunistic hope that her successful daughter was back to save them once again. I saw my father straighten his back, a pathetic attempt to look proud, as if he had played any part in the woman standing before him. I adjusted the microphone. The room fell into a hush so profound you could hear the air conditioning hum. "Good morning," I said. My voice was clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of the waver it used to have when I begged them for permission to leave the house. I want to talk to you today about a specific kind of isolation, not the geographical kind that defines our beautiful state of Idaho, but the psychological kind. The kind that happens when the people who are supposed to be your anchors become your chains. I saw my father flinch. My mother's face went pale, her pride evaporating into a dawning terror. 10 years ago, I continued, my eyes never leaving theirs, I was told that my only value was my labor. I was told that my dreams were a betrayal of my duty. I was told that I was nothing without the family that claimed to need me. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of their deception hang in the air for everyone to feel. Today, I am here to tell you that duty without love is not a family, it's a prison. And sometimes, the only way to find your future is to set fire to the house that tried to keep you captive. The journey to this stage started in a dark room with a stolen letter and a broken heart. But standing here now, watching the architects of my misery realize that their unpaid servant was now their only hope, I knew one thing for certain. The debt is paid, and I am finally, truly, free. The memories of my childhood in Idaho don't come back in colors. They come in sensations. The bite of the frost on my knuckles at 5 a.m., the smell of diesel and dried manure clinging to my skin, the heavy, suffocating silence of a house where my voice was only heard when I was saying, "Yes, Mother," or "Dinner is ready." We lived on a sprawling ranch outside of McCall, tucked deep into the rugged, unforgiving beauty of the Idaho backcountry. To the tourists, it was a paradise of jagged peaks and crystalline lakes. To me, it was a fortress. And my parents, Gerald and Martha, were its keepers. In the Joan household, there was a hierarchy as rigid as the mountain ranges surrounding us. At the very top sat my brother, Caleb. Caleb was 3 years older, a physical specimen who seemed to have been carved out of the very granite of the Sawtooths. By the time he was a sophomore in high school, he was already a statewide legend, the star quarterback who was going to lead our small-town team to a championship Idaho would never forget. Every wall in our living room was a shrine to him. Shelves groaned under the weight of his trophies. Framed newspaper clippings from the Idaho Statesman chronicled his every touchdown, his every clutch performance, his every heroic moment on the field. My parents didn't just love Caleb. They worshipped him. He was the golden child, the one who carried the family's hopes on his broad shoulders. And then there was me. If Caleb was the sun, I was the cold, dark space between the stars. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't a bad kid. I was simply invisible. I learned very early on that in our house, Madison's tears or in this case, Caleb's minor bruises, were always louder than my greatest achievements. My day began long before the sun hit the valley floor. While Caleb slept in, resting his $1,000,000 arm for practice, I was in the mud. I was the one who fed the cattle. I was the one who hauled the heavy feed bags until my shoulders burned. I was the one who scrubbed the grit from the floors and ensured that breakfast was hot and ready the moment my father walked into the kitchen. "Blanche, did you check the north fence?" my father would bark, never looking up from the sports section of the paper. "Yes, Dad, it's fixed." "Good. Caleb needs a clean jersey for the scout visit today. Make sure you iron it. He needs to look like a pro." That was my existence. I was an unpaid servant disguised as a daughter. My parents weaponized the idea of filial duty to keep me chained to the chores they didn't want to do. They called it being the heart of the home. But what they really meant was that I was the grease in the machine that kept Caleb's life running smoothly. I remember one specific Tuesday. I was 14. I had spent months working on a research paper for my advanced biology class. I had stayed up until the early hours of the morning, my eyes stinging, reading by the dim glow of a desk lamp while the rest of the house dreamed. When the teacher handed it back, there was a bright red A+ at the top and a note. "Exceptional work, Blanche. You have a scientific mind that this state needs." I was vibrating with a rare, dangerous thing: hope. I ran home, the paper clutched in my hand like a golden ticket. I burst through the back door, the smell of pine and rain following me in. "Mom, Dad," I shouted, my voice cracking with excitement. "Look!" My biology teacher said my research on local water tables was... I stopped. My mother was standing by the counter, her face pale, a phone pressed to her ear. My father was pacing the linoleum, his jaw set. They didn't even look at me. "He felt a pop in his shoulder during the scrimmage," my mother whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "Yes, we're taking him to the specialist in Boise." "Caleb?" I asked, my hand slowly lowering the paper. "He might have a torn labrum, Blanche," my father snapped, finally looking at me, but his eyes were full of a terrifying resentment. "Do you have any idea what that means for his scholarship? For his future?" I'm sorry. I just wanted to show you my grade. The teacher said I was..." "Not now, Blanche," my mother cut me off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Your brother is in pain. He needs us. Can't you see we have a real crisis here? Go start the laundry. We're going to be in Boise for 2 days. You need to handle the ranch while we're gone." I stood there, holding my A+, feeling like a ghost. Nobody asked to see it. Nobody asked why I was proud. I watched them rush out to the truck, their movements frantic and full of purpose. They were a family of 3, and I was the caretaker they left behind to keep the lights on. I walked to the kitchen trash can and dropped the paper inside. It didn't even make a sound. That was the pattern. Caleb needed more attention. Caleb was sensitive. Caleb required careful handling. I, on the other hand, was expected to be the bigger person. I was told that my independence, my desire to study, my dreams of leaving Idaho, was a form of selfishness. "Family is about unity, Blanche," my mother would tell me whenever I asked if I could join an after-school club. "Your brother is out there representing this family name. The least you can do is support us here. You're so lucky to have a family that needs you." Needs me. It was a trap. A beautiful, suffocating trap built on the rugged landscapes of Idaho. They made me feel like my only value was my utility. If I wasn't cooking, I was invisible. If I wasn't cleaning, I was a burden. If I wasn't phoning it in as their unpaid the nurse for my father's chronic back pain, I was disloyal. I started to take up less space. I learned to celebrate my victories in the dark. I became a ghost in my own home, present only when there was a mess to be cleared or a meal to be served. I told myself I just needed to survive until graduation. 4 years. I could make it 4 years. I would go to the library in town just to be around people who didn't know I was the slow one or the helper. I would stare at the university posters on the wall, the ones showing laboratories and lecture halls, and I would imagine myself there. far away from the smell of hay and the sound of my father's disappointment. But as the years went on, the walls felt like they were closing in. Caleb's star continued to rise, and as it did, my parents' demands grew heavier. They weren't just asking for help anymore. They were demanding my life. They were preparing to keep me in that house forever, a permanent fixture of their convenience, a servant who shared their last name, but none of their love. I didn't know it then, but the breaking point wasn't coming from a fight or an argument. It was coming in the mail, a single envelope that would prove once and for all that my parents weren't just neglectful, they were the architects of my misery. And they were willing to steal my entire future, just to make sure their own lives remained comfortable. The nights in Idaho are a specific kind of quiet. Out on our ranch, miles from the nearest streetlight, the darkness feels heavy, like it's pressing against the windows, trying to get in. But inside my room, under the scratchy wool blankets, there was a different kind of darkness. It was the darkness of a secret life. I was 19 years old. My peers from high school were already moving into dorms in Boise or heading out of state to places where the world felt wider. But I was still here, anchored to the floorboards of a house that viewed me as a utility rather than a person. By day, I was the daughter who hauled hay, scrubbed the grease traps, and stood ready to assist my father, Gerald, every time he let out a theatrical groan about his shattered back. But by night, after the house had finally settled into its rhythmic creaks, I became a ghost. I would wait until I heard the heavy, rhythmic snoring of my parents from down the hall. Only then would I reach under my mattress and pull out the worn biology textbooks I'd hidden there. I didn't dare turn on the overhead light. The glow under the door would have been a death sentence for my plans. Instead, I used a small plastic flashlight, the kind you buy for emergency kits. I would grip it between my teeth or propped against my shoulder, the beam illuminating the pages of organic chemistry and human anatomy. My eyes would ache. The tiny print would swim under the flickering yellow light, but I didn't stop. These books weren't just information. They were my map out of the wilderness. I was applying to one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country, a place that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the smell of diesel and cattle feed. I had spent months secretly gathering my transcripts, drafting my personal statement, and corresponding with the admissions office via a burner email I accessed only at the public library once a week. Every night was a gamble. I was exhausted, my body physically drained from the 14 hours of labor I had performed during the day. But the adrenaline of hope kept me awake. I would trace the diagrams of the human heart, memorizing the valves and the chambers, imagining a life where I was the one wearing the white coat, the one who actually knew how to heal, rather than the one forced to care for people who weren't actually sick. But hope is a dangerous thing to hide in a house built on control. The first signs of their suspicion were subtle. It started with my mother, Martha. She had a way of hovering in the doorway, her eyes narrowed, scanning my room for anything that looked like ambition. To them, my ambition was a betrayal. It was a rejection of the family unity they used as a shield to keep me trapped. "You look tired, Blanche," she said one morning, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine concern. I was standing at the stove frying eggs for Caleb and my father. My eyes were bloodshot from 4 hours of sleep, and my head felt like it was filled with lead. "I'm fine, Mom." "Just didn't sleep well," I replied, keeping my back to her. "You've been distracted lately," she continued, her footsteps clicking on the linoleum as she moved closer. "Your father had to call for you 3 times yesterday while you were in the shed. He was in a lot of pain, and you were just staring at nothing." "I was just thinking about the chores," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then came the second layer of the trap, the weaponization of my father's condition. Gerald's back injury was the centerpiece of our household. It was a vague, undiagnosable ailment that flared up whenever I showed a spark of independence. If I wanted to go into town for an hour, he couldn't reach his water. If I asked for a weekend off, his legs were tingling, and he was sure a stroke was coming. "Blanche!" he roared from the living room, his voice full of practiced agony. I abandoned the eggs and hurried into the room. He was reclined in his massive leather chair, his face contorted into a grimace that I now knew was entirely performative. "My back is seizing up again," he wheezed, clutching his side. "I need you to help me move to the bed. And I need those heat packs prepped. Now." As I took his arm, feeling the strength he was trying so hard to hide, I saw him look at me. It wasn't the look of a father in pain. It was the look of a warden checking the locks. He saw the way I held myself, the way my mind seemed to be elsewhere. He could feel my spirit pulling away, and he hated it. "Your mother says you've been spending a lot of time at the library," he said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register as I helped him stand. "Why is that? You have plenty to do here. That garden isn't going to weed itself, and Caleb needs his truck detailed before the scouts come back." "I'm just reading, Dad. It helps pass the time." "Reading." He spat the word like it was a curse. "Reading doesn't pay the bills, Blanche, and it doesn't take care of your family. You need to remember where your loyalty lies. You're lucky we have a place for you here. Most girls would be grateful to have a family that needs them this much." The guilt was a heavy, invisible weight. They wanted me to believe that by wanting a future, I was actively hurting them. They wanted me to feel like a bad daughter for wanting to be a doctor. Every time I reached for my flashlight at night, I had to fight the voice in my head that sounded exactly like my mother. "How can you be so selfish? Your father is suffering and you're dreaming of leaving?" But the suspicion was mounting. They started checking my laundry, looking for anything I might be hiding. They began monitoring my movements more closely, timing my trips into town. One afternoon, I came home to find my desk drawer had been rifled through. They didn't find the books. I had hidden them too well. But they found my notebooks, pages of visual notes and flowcharts I had drawn to memorize biological systems. That night, dinner was a cold affair. The air was thick with the unsaid. Caleb was talking about his football prospects, his voice loud and arrogant, while my parents hung on his every word. But I could feel their eyes on me. "We found your drawings, Blanche," my mother said, her voice quiet and sharp. She didn't look up from her plate. "Very detailed. It looks like you're putting a lot of effort into things that don't involve this ranch." "It's just a hobby, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "We don't have room for hobbies that take your focus away from your duties," my father added, slamming his glass down on the table. "I'm in pain every day, Blanche. Every day. And you're drawing pictures of hearts? You should be focusing on how to make this home run better. You're the one who stays. Remember that." I looked down at my plate, the tears stinging my eyes. I realized then that they weren't just suspicious, they were afraid. They knew that if I realized my own worth, their unpaid caregiver would be gone. And they were prepared to do anything to keep me under that yellow flashlight beam. In the dark, forever. I went to my room that night and didn't pull out my books. I sat in the darkness, listening to the Idaho wind howl through the pines. My application was out. The letters were already in the mail. And I knew, if I didn't get out soon, they would find a way to break me. I clutched my plastic flashlight in the dark, my knuckles white. "Just one more month," I whispered to myself. "Just let me survive one more month." The month of April in Idaho is a cruel tease. One day the sun bleeds across the Sawtooth Peaks, promising a thaw. And the next, a sudden biting wind sweeps down the valley, freezing the mud into jagged, ankle-breaking ruts. It was a landscape of broken promises. And for me, it was the season of my slow, agonizing undoing. Every afternoon at exactly 2 p.m., the ritual began. I would wait for the sound of the rusted mail truck, a distant, rhythmic rattling that echoed through the pines. My heart would kick against my ribs, a wild, hopeful bird trapped in a cage of bone. I would wipe the dishwater from my hands, throw on a threadbare coat, and trek down the long gravel driveway. The walk was nearly half a mile, but I never felt the cold. All I felt was the burning heat of anticipation. "This is the day," I would tell myself. "Today, the envelope will be there. The one with the university seal. The one that says, I'm more than a maid. the one that says, I'm finally real. But every time I reached the end of the road and pulled open the heavy galvanized lid of the mailbox, there was nothing. Just the hollow metallic ring of an empty vessel. Or worse, bills for my father's treatments. Sports magazines featuring athletes who looked like my brother Caleb, and glossy flyers for local feed stores. Day after day, week after week, the silence from the university was deafening. It was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, making it harder to breathe. I had checked my burner email at the library. No news. I had checked the mailbox until my fingers were numb. Nothing. Back at the house, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of silence, a predatory silence. My parents, Gerald and Martha, watched me from the kitchen window like hawks circling a wounded lamb. They saw my slumped shoulders as I walked back up the drive. They saw the way I avoided their eyes. And I could see the faint, sickening flicker of satisfaction in the way my father leaned back in his recliner. Nothing again, Blanche? My mother would ask, her voice tilting with a false, saccharine sympathy that made my skin crawl. She would be standing over the stove, stirring a pot of stew, the steam rising around her like a shroud. I told you, these big schools, they move slow, especially for kids from places like this. Maybe they're just busy, I would whisper, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. Busy? Or maybe they've just made their decision, my father would bark from the living room, his voice full of that practiced, gravelly authority. They don't send letters to everyone, you know. Sometimes, if you're not what they're looking for, they just don't bother wasting the postage. The frustration began to boil under my skin. I had worked so hard. I had studied under that plastic flashlight until my eyes bled. I had the grades. I had the drive. Why was the world staying so quiet? The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I was scrubbing the grout in the upstairs bathroom, a task my mother had assigned me because she couldn't stand the sight of a smudge, when I heard them talking downstairs. Their voices were low, hushed, the way they talked when they were deciding Caleb's future. But Caleb was gone, at a training camp in Boise. They were talking about me. I crept to the top of the stairs, my heart thundering. She's going to ask again, my mother whispered. She's getting restless, Gerald. She was looking at the phone earlier. Let her ask, my father replied, his voice cold and flat. The answer is the same. We're doing this for her own good. She's not built for the world out there. She's fragile. She's academic in her head, but not in her bones. She belongs here, where she's needed. But if she calls them... She won't. I've handled the phone logs. And besides, who is she going to believe? A stranger at a desk or her own father? I froze. A cold, oily dread began to seep through my veins. Handled the phone logs? Before I could process the thought, I heard my mother's footsteps approaching the stairs. I scrambled back into the bathroom and began scrubbing the tile with a frantic, desperate energy. That evening, the trap finally snapped shut. We were sitting at the dinner table, the same mahogany table where every one of Caleb's trophies had been toasted. The air was suffocatingly still. My father sat at the head, his bad back supposedly flared up again, his cane leaning against the table like a scepter. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling as I gripped my fork, "I need to call the admissions office. It's been 6 weeks. Everyone else at the library, they've already heard. Something is wrong." My mother stopped mid-chew. She looked at my father. Slowly, Gerald set his fork down. The clatter of the metal against the china sounded like a gunshot. "We were going to wait to tell you, Blanche," he began, his voice dropping into that deep, patronizing tone he used for the slow one. He sighed, a long, weary sound, as if my very existence was an exhausting burden. "We wanted to spare your feelings. We wanted to give you time to settle back into reality." "Tell me what?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands began to shake under the table. "The school reached out, sweetheart," my mother said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her skin felt like ice. "They sent a notification a few days ago. We didn't want to show it to you because it was so blunt. A notification, I breathed. Where is it? Why didn't you give it to me? Because it confirmed what we've been trying to tell you all along, my father interrupted, his eyes boring into mine with a terrifying, calculated intensity. They said you didn't have the foundational skills for the program. They said your background, your abilities simply aren't up to their standards. They said you weren't academic material. No, I whispered. That's not. My grades were perfect. My teachers said, high school teachers in rural Idaho will tell you anything to make themselves feel better, Blanche. Gerald slammed his palm on the table, making the glasses rattle. The real world, the medical world, they don't have time for girls who spend their nights dreaming instead of doing. They saw right through you. They saw that you're a caregiver, not a doctor. They saw that you belong here. They said, I wasn't enough? The words felt like shards of glass in my throat. They said you weren't capable, my mother added, her voice a soft, poisonous caress. And honestly, Blanche, we agree. We've seen you struggle. We've seen how stressed you get just trying to manage this house. How could you possibly manage a hospital? It's for the best. You'd only fail out there and the humiliation would break you. At least here, you're safe. You have a purpose. You have us. The room began to spin. Every late-night study session, every hidden book, every ounce of hope I had poured into those applications. It all came crashing down. I felt small, so incredibly, devastatingly small. I looked at my hands, the hands that were raw from bleach and calloused from manual labor, and for the first time, I believed them. I wasn't the brilliant student my teachers had praised. I was the slow one. I was the unambitious daughter who couldn't even get a letter from a university. I was a failure before I had even started. Don't cry, my father said, though there wasn't a hint of kindness in his voice. Crying just proves they were right. It proves you're too emotional, too weak. Now clear the table. I need my heat packs prepped. My back is killing me, and your mother has a headache. I stood up, my legs feeling like water. I began to stack the plates, the movement mechanical and hollow. I felt like a ghost, invisible, erased, exactly like Olivia had described. I was 19 years old, and my future had been declared dead at the dinner table. I didn't see the way my mother's eyes flicked to the locked cabinet in the hallway. I didn't see the way my father's hands, which were supposedly too weak to lift a kettle, gripped his cane with triumphant strength. All I felt was the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. I was nothing but an unpaid servant with a fancy dream. And today, that dream had finally been buried under the cold, hard dirt of Idaho. Yes, Dad, I whispered, my voice a dead thing. I'll get the packs. As I turned toward the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of myself in the darkened window. I didn't recognize the girl staring back. Her light had been dimmed. Her spirit had been broken. And the architects of my misery? They were just getting started. The 3 years that followed the rejection didn't pass in days or months. They passed in the accumulation of gray Idaho winters and the steady, soul-crushing erosion of my self-worth. In that rotting wooden cabin, tucked away from the eyes of a world that was moving on without me, I ceased to be Blanche Joan, the aspiring doctor. I became a ghost in a nursing uniform, an unpaid, invisible extension of my parents' needs. The psychological shift happened slowly, then all at once. At first, I would still look at my hidden textbooks with a lingering ache, but as the months turned into a year, and then 2, the poison Gerald and Martha had dripped into my ear began to settle in my bones. I started to believe them. When I struggled to remember a specific medical term, or felt too exhausted to solve a simple math problem in my head, a voice that sounded exactly like my father would sneer in the back of my mind. See, they were right. You aren't academic material. You're barely keeping it together here. How did you think you could handle a surgical theater? I was trapped in an architecture of deception so complete, I didn't even realize the walls were fake. My father's back injury, became the sun around which our entire miserable universe drifted. Every morning began at 4:30 a.m. with the sound of his cane thumping against the floorboards, a rhythmic, demanding pulse that summoned me to his bedside. I would lift his dead weight, my own spine screaming in protest, to help him to the chair. I would dress him, wash him, and prep the endless rotation of heat packs and medications. "Careful, Blanche. God, you're so clumsy," he'd hiss as I adjusted his pillow. "No wonder that university didn't want you. You don't have the hands for medicine. You're a farmhand at best. Just be glad I'm patient enough to let you practice on me." My mother was the silent architect of the guilt. She didn't yell, she sighed. She played the role of the weary martyr, constantly reminding me of the sacrifice they were making by letting me stay. "We could have hired a professional, Blanche," she'd say while I scrubbed the grease from the kitchen floor after cooking a 3-course meal for them and Caleb. "But we wanted to keep the family together. We wanted to give you a purpose, since you didn't have anywhere else to go." The word purpose was a lead weight. They had weaponized my desire to help, my natural inclination toward caregiving, and turned it into a leash. I was 21, then 22, then 23, and while my body was young, my spirit felt like the ancient weathered timber of our barn. The isolation was geographical, yes. The rugged Idaho landscape that tourists called majestic was just a series of barriers to me. But it was social, too. I watched my peers from high school through the distorted lens of social media when I could steal 5 minutes on my phone. I saw their graduation photos from Boise State. I saw them moving into apartments in Seattle or Portland. I saw them holding stethoscopes, wearing graduation caps, and smiling in bars with friends I used to have. I was the only one who stayed. I was the girl who didn't make the cut. Sometimes an old friend would call, "Blanche, we're heading to Coeur d'Alene for the weekend. You should come." I'd look at the pile of my father's soiled linens and the list of chores my mother had left on the counter. "I can't," I'd whisper, the shame hot in my throat. "My dad, he's having a bad week. He needs me." "You're such a saint, Blanche," they'd say. But I didn't feel like a saint. I felt like a prisoner who had begun to love her cell. I started to resent the calls. I started to resent the sunlight. I stayed inside the cabin, the air thick with the smell of menthol rub, stale soup, and the suffocating scent of stagnant lives. My existence was measured in bedpans, laundry loads, and the biting remarks that reminded me of my limitations. The manipulation was calculated. Whenever I showed a spark of the old Blanche, whenever I picked up a book or mentioned wanting to take a community college course online, the crisis would hit. My father's legs would go numb. My mother would have a heart flutter from the stress of managing everything alone. They would create a hurricane of need that required me to drop everything and anchor them. "How can you think about school right now?" my mother would sob, her hand clutching her chest. "After everything we've done? After we took you in when the world rejected you? You're so selfish, Blanche. Just like your brother says, you only think about yourself." Caleb, the golden child. He would visit once every few months, breezing in with his expensive gym clothes and stories of his pro-track training. He'd sit at the table I'd scrubbed, eating the food I'd cooked, and talk over me as if I were part of the furniture. "You're lucky, sis," he'd say, leaning back and picking his teeth. "No bills, no pressure, just hanging out with Mom and Dad. It's a good gig for someone like you. Not everyone is built for the grind, you know." And I would just nod. I would take his plate and wash it. I would listen to my father tell him how proud he was of his real success, while I stood 3 feet away, the invisible engine keeping their lives from falling apart. By the end of the 3rd year, the transformation was almost complete. I stopped looking at the mountains. I stopped checking the mail. I stopped believing there was anything for me beyond the perimeter of that ranch. I was convinced that I was sick in my own way, mentally incapable, academic deficient, and fundamentally less than. I accepted the verbal abuse as honesty. I accepted the manual labor as repayment. I was a victim of domestic exploitation, chained to their bedsides by a ghost lock called filial duty. I had become exactly what they needed me to be, a tool. A piece of equipment that didn't need a salary, didn't need a day off, and most importantly, didn't need a future. But even in the deepest winter, there is a limit to how much weight a structure can hold before it begins to crack. The cabin was rotting, and I was rotting with it. But beneath the layers of guilt and the grime of servitude, there was a tiny, microscopic spark of the girl who had once spent her nights with a plastic flashlight. She was buried deep. She was silent. She was almost dead. But she was still there, and she was waiting for the one thing my parents hadn't accounted for. She was waiting for the truth to rot the floorboards out from under their lies. The winter of my 22nd year didn't just bring the snow. It brought a coldness that finally settled into the marrow of my bones, past the layers of wool and the thicker layers of self-deception I had worn for 3 long years. In Idaho, winter is a relentless predator. It doesn't just fall, it colonizes. The wind howls down from the sawtooths with a jagged edge that feels like it's trying to strip the skin from your face. For 3 years, I had survived on a diet of psychological manipulation and forced gratitude. I had spent every waking hour telling myself that my parents were right, that I was too academic deficient for the real world, and that my only true value lay in the manual labor I provided for the family. I had become the invisible engine of the Joan Ranch, an unpaid servant chained to the bedside of a father who weaponized his chronic pain to keep me within reach. That morning, the temperature had plummeted to 10 below zero. The driveway, nearly half a mile of gravel and ruts, was buried under 4 feet of heavy, wet snow. My brother Caleb was in Boise, basking in the glow of his athletic scholarship, and my father, Gerald, had spent the morning groaning from his recliner about the pressure in his spine caused by the barometric shift. "Blanche, the propane truck won't make it up the drive if that snow isn't cleared," he barked from the warmth of the living room, never looking up from the television. "Unless you want us all to freeze because you're too lazy to pick up a shovel." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I had been trained to view any moment of self-preservation as a betrayal of family unity. I pulled on my worn boots, grabbed the heavy steel shovel, and stepped out into the white abyss. The first hour was manageable. The second hour was a blur of burning lungs and trembling muscles. By the third hour, the world began to tilt. My vision was blurring at the edges, the bright white of the snow turning into a dull, pulsating gray. I hadn't eaten since the previous night. There hadn't been time after prepping Gerald's heat packs and scrubbing the mud Caleb had tracked in during his brief visit. My heart was kicking against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just 10 more feet, I told myself. Just show them you're capable of this one thing. I was still trying to earn the love of people who had already decided I was a tool, not a daughter. Then, the air seemed to vanish. I remember the shovel slipping from my numb fingers. I remember the sound of my own knees hitting the frozen gravel, a dull, sickening thud. And then, there was only the silence of the Idaho sky as I slumped forward into the drift. I don't know how long I lay there. When I finally came to, my face was half buried in the snow, and the skin of my cheeks felt like it was being seared by ice. My head was throbbing with a rhythmic, all-consuming pain, the kind of concussion-level agony Olivia had described after her accident. I tried to push myself up, but my arms were like water. "Blanche, what are you doing laying down on the job?" My mother's voice didn't come from a place of concern. It came from the porch, sharp and impatient. I managed to roll over, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I looked up to see Martha standing there, her arms crossed over her designer cardigan, looking at me with a disgust so profound it felt worse than the cold. I fell, Mom," I managed to whisper, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they might shatter. "I think I blacked out." Blacked out, or just looking for an excuse to stop working? Gerald's voice joined hers as he shuffled to the doorway, leaning on the cane he only used when someone was watching. He didn't rush down to help me. He didn't check if I was breathing. He just stared at the half-cleared driveway. "It's 5 o'clock, Blanche," he snapped, his jaw tightening. "The sun is going down and the kitchen is cold. Where is dinner? I've been sitting in that chair for 4 hours waiting for my meds and a hot meal, and you're out here playing in the snow?" "I'm sick, Dad," I sobbed, the tears freezing on my lashes. I can't feel my hands." "Sick? You're not sick. You're just dramatic," he sneered, using the exact words that had once broken Olivia's heart. "We took you in when that university saw through your academic facade and realized you were worthless. We gave you a roof and a purpose. And this is how you repay us? By letting your father go hungry because you had a dizzy spell?" In that moment, lying in the dirt and the ice, the 3 years of self-deception finally shattered. I looked at their faces, the people who had intercepted my mail, stolen my future, and turned me into a domestic slave. I didn't see parents. I didn't see a family that needed me. I saw architects of misery who only valued the convenience I brought to their lives. If I died in this snowbank, they wouldn't mourn the daughter they lost. They would moan about the chores that wouldn't get done. They didn't love me. They loved the unpaid youth nurse I had become. I'm sorry," I whispered. But for the first time, the words weren't a plea for forgiveness. They were a goodbye. "Get up," Martha commanded, turning back toward the warmth of the house. "Clear the rest of that path and get inside. I want the roast started in 10 minutes, or don't bother coming in at all." They went back inside and shut the heavy oak door, the click of the lock echoing like a gavel. I sat there in the silence, my hands finally beginning to burn with the first signs of frostbite. I looked at the house, the fortress that had become my prison. I had spent 3 years believing I was the slow one, the disappointment, the one who was lucky to be allowed to serve. I had internalized their lies until they were my only truth. But as I watched the smoke rise from the chimney, smoke from the wood I had chopped and hauled, I realized I wasn't the broken one. They were. They were the ones who were sick. They were the ones who were incapable of love. I didn't get up to finish the driveway. I didn't go in to start the roast. I sat there in the freezing dark of Idaho, and I began to reclaim my mind from the architects of my misery. The golden child could have the trophies. The golden child could have the inheritance. I wanted something they could never understand. I wanted the truth, and for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly where to find it. I looked at the locked cabinet through the kitchen window, and I felt a cold, calculated independence begin to take root where the guilt used to be. This was my rock bottom, and from here, the only way was out. The heavy oak door of the ranch house clicked shut behind me. But the sound didn't signal safety. It signaled the return to my cage. The warmth of the kitchen, usually a relief after the biting Idaho wind, felt cloying and thick with the scent of a roast I hadn't even started yet. My hands were still numb, tingling with a painful heat as the blood struggled to return to my fingertips. My parents had already retreated to the living room, the flickering blue light of the television casting long, distorted shadows across the hallway. "Blanche, the medicine, now!" My father's voice rattled the floorboards. It wasn't the voice of a man in pain. It was the voice of a commander whose favorite tool had momentarily malfunctioned. He claimed his chronic spinal compression was flaring up from the cold, the same cold he had forced me to stand in for 3 hours. "It's in the study," my mother shouted from the kitchen, her voice sharp and impatient. "In your father's desk, the blue bottle. And don't you dare touch anything else." I walked toward the study, my boots heavy on the linoleum. The study was the heart of the Joan Ranch, a room filled with the smell of old leather, gun oil, and the suffocating weight of my father's authority. It was off limits. Usually, I was only allowed in there to scrub the baseboards or polish the mahogany desk. But today, they were too comfortable, too sure of my broken spirit, to worry about the locks. I stepped inside and closed the door softly. The silence in the room was absolute. I walked to the massive desk, my eyes scanning for the blue bottle. But as I reached for the drawer, my gaze drifted to the bottom right cabinet, the one Gerald always kept double locked. For 3 years, I had been told that I was academic deficient. I had been told that the prestigious medical program I dreamed of had rejected me with blunt finality because I wasn't enough. I had believed them. I had let that belief become the foundation of my servitude. But the look on their faces at the porch, the way they looked at me not as a daughter, but as a failing appliance, it had cracked the seal on my memory. I didn't look for the medicine. Instead, I knelt on the cold floor. My hands were still shaking, but not from the cold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, bent piece of wire I had salvaged from the fence repair earlier that morning. It was a crude tool, but 3 years of manual labor had taught me more about the mechanics of locks and latches than my father ever realized. Click. The cabinet doors swung open with a slow, agonizing groan. Inside sat a small mahogany box with brass hinges, identical to the one my grandmother Eleanor had once described as a vessel for truth. I pulled it out, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. The box on top lay a stack of envelopes. I recognized the logo immediately, the University of Washington School of Medicine. The envelope was thick, the kind of thickness that only comes with an acceptance package, orientation materials, and a future. I pulled out the letter. My eyes blurred as the letters swam across the page, my dyslexia struggling to anchor the words. But then the message stabilized. Dear Miss Blanche Joan, it is with great pleasure that we inform you of your acceptance into the class of 2021. The date at the top of the letter was April 14th, 3 years ago. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. This was the letter I had waited for. This was the hope I had trekked to the mailbox for every day of that long-lost spring. My parents had told me the university called me incapable. They told me they were protecting me from the humiliation of failure. They hadn't protected me, they had intercepted my life. I dug deeper into the box. Beneath the letter were 3 other documents, official notifications of the Northwest Excellence Scholarship. It was a full ride grant covering tuition, housing, and a stipend. I wouldn't have needed a single dime from Gerald and Martha. I wouldn't have needed their permission. I sat there on the floor of the study, the paper crinkling in my grip. The shock was a cold, white light that stripped away every lie I had told myself. I thought about the 1,095 days I had spent lifting my father's dead weight. I thought about the thousands of meals I had cooked, the miles of fences I had mended, and the nights I had spent crying into my pillow because I thought I was too stupid to be anything more than a slave. They hadn't just hidden a letter. They had stolen 3 years of my youth. They had weaponized my filial duty to ensure they never had to pay for a youth nurse or a ranch hand. I was the unpaid servant they had chained to their bedside through the most sophisticated form of domestic exploitation. Guilt. The shock began to recede, leaving behind something far more dangerous. It was a cold, calculated fury, the kind of rage that doesn't scream, but plans. I looked at the scholarship papers. They had been returned to sender, with my father's forged signature, claiming I had declined due to family obligations. My father's handwriting was steady and arrogant. He had signed away my life with the same casual indifference he used to order a bag of feed. "Blanche, where is that medicine?" Gerald's roar echoed from the hallway. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. I carefully folded the letter and the scholarship documents and tucked them into the lining of my coat. I placed the mahogany box back into the cabinet and relocked it with a soft, decisive click. I grabbed the blue bottle of pills from the top drawer. I stood up and caught my reflection in the window. The girl who had collapsed in the snow was gone. In her place was a woman who realized she was the only one who could save herself. I was no longer a victim. I was an active strategist. I walked out of the study, my face a mask of the same hollow obedience they had come to expect. I walked into the living room and handed the bottle to my father. "Here, Dad," I said, my voice as flat as the Idaho plains. I'm sorry it took so long. I had trouble finding it. He snatched the bottle from my hand without a word of thanks. Took you long enough. Get to the kitchen. That roast won't cook itself. Yes, Dad, I replied. As I walked toward the kitchen, I began to map out the next 72 hours. I would need my birth certificate and my Social Security card. I would need to find a way to the library in town to use the burner email one last time. I would contact the university's admissions office, not to ask for permission, but to demand my second chance. The architects of my misery thought they had buried me. They didn't realize that in the dark, under the weight of their lies, I had been growing roots. The storm outside was still howling, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of the cold. I was the storm. And when I finally left this house, I would make sure there was nothing left for them to hold on to but the silence of their own greed. I began to peel the potatoes, the knife moving with a sharp, rhythmic precision. One more day, I whispered to the rhythm of the blade. Just one more day. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into the living room and throw the yellowed, stolen letter in my father's face, though every muscle in my body screamed to do it. That would have been the old Blanche, the emotional girl, the fragile daughter they had spent 3 years inventing. If I had confronted them then, I would have lost. They would have burned the documents, locked the doors, and used my outburst as further proof that I was mentally unstable. Instead, I became a ghost of my own making. I became the most perfect, obedient servant they had ever seen. I played the role of the unpaid caregiver with a chilling, calculated precision. I prepped the heat packs. I scrubbed the floors until they shone. I listened to my mother's sighs and my father's groans without a single flicker of resentment on my face. Behind that mask, I was a woman at war. My first mission was the paper trail. In the rugged backcountry of Idaho, you are only as real as the documents in your hand. I knew my birth certificate and Social Security card were kept in the same mahogany box where they had hidden my future. I waited. I watched. I learned the rhythm of their lives better than they knew it themselves. I waited for the first Tuesday of the month, the day my mother drove into McCall for her luxury hair appointment, and my father took his long, medicated afternoon nap. The study felt colder than usual as I stepped inside. My heart was a drum in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that I was sure would wake the entire valley. I knelt by the cabinet. Click. The bent wire worked again. I didn't reach for the letters this time. I reached for the thick blue folder at the bottom. There they were, the official proof of my existence. I pulled my birth certificate and my Social Security card from the sleeves. My hands trembled as I tucked them into the waistband of my jeans, the cold paper pressing against my skin like a brand. I replaced the folder. I relocked the cabinet. I was halfway out the door when I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of my father's cane in the hallway. "Blanche, what are you doing in there?" I froze. Every instinct told me to run, to bolt through the window and into the pines. But I forced my shoulders to drop. I turned around, a dusting rag in my hand that I had hidden in my sleeve. "Just dusting the bookshelves, Dad," I said, my voice as flat and empty as a winter sky. "You said the room was smelling like old paper." He stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowed, searching for the spark of rebellion he thought he had extinguished years ago. He looked at the desk, then back at me. "Get to the kitchen," he growled. "I want tea, and don't be lurking in here. This is a place of business. Not for girls who can't read a ledger." "Yes, Dad." I walked past him, the documents scratching against my skin. I didn't breathe until I was in the kitchen, the kettle whistling a shrill, mocking tune. Phase 2 was the digital reclamation. I couldn't risk using the home computer. My father monitored the router logs with a paranoid intensity. I needed the town library. For weeks. I began skimming from the grocery money. $1 here, $2 there. I told my mother the price of propane had gone up, that the feed store was charging more for salt licks. I was building a freedom fund, one crumpled $5 bill at a time, hidden inside the lining of my old winter boots. when I finally made it to the McCaw Public Library. I didn't look at the magazines or the bestsellers. I sat at a back terminal, my heart racing as I typed in the address for the University of Washington's admissions office. I didn't use my old name. I used the burner email I had created years ago. Subject: regarding acceptance letter, class of 2021. Blanche, Joan. I wrote the email with the cold, desperate honesty of a prisoner sending a message in a bottle. I told them everything. I told them about the rejection I was told I received. I told them about the intercepted mail. I told them I had been held as an unpaid caregiver for 3 years under false pretenses. I told them I still had the letter. And I still had the dream. I clicked send and felt a wave of nausea. I expected silence. I expected a polite, automated response saying the window had closed years ago. But 3 days later, I returned to the library, and there, sitting in my inbox, was a lifeline. The email wasn't from a clerk. It was from Dr. Harrison Vance, the Dean of Graduate Studies. Dear Ms. Joan, I remember your application vividly. Your research on rural healthcare equity was some of the most insightful work I had seen in a decade. When we didn't hear back from you, we were deeply saddened. We assumed you had chosen a different path. The words felt like a physical touch, a hand reaching through the screen to pull me out of the mud. I am horrified to hear of your circumstances. In this department, we believe in second chances. We believe that potential shouldn't be stifled by the architects of misery. If you can make it to Boise for an interview, I will personally advocate for your re-enrollment. I've already contacted our legal liaison regarding the scholarship funds that were declined in your name. We are waiting for you, Blanche. Do not let them dim your light. I sat in that library and cried. Not the silent, hopeless tears of the past 3 years, but the hot, cleansing tears of a woman who had just been handed a key to her own cage. Dr. Vance was my Eleanor Smith, my beacon in the storm. But the rebellion wasn't over. I had to get out. I had to fund a bus ticket, a week in a motel, and a life away from the ranch. All while my parents watched me with increasing suspicion. Gerald began to notice the change in the atmosphere. He could sense that the unpaid servant was no longer quite so broken. He would find me staring at the mountains or catch me pocketing the change from his medication runs. "You're getting greedy, Blanche," he sneered one evening, snatching the receipt from my hand. "Where is the rest of the change? This says $42. You gave me $5 back." "The pharmacist charged a convenience fee for the delivery, Dad," I lied, my voice steady. "I have the receipt right here." I handed him a forged slip I had spent hours perfecting at the library. He crumpled it and threw it at me. "You're lucky we don't charge you rent, you ungrateful brat. If it weren't for us, you'd be on the street. Remember that the next time you think about stealing from the people who saved you from your own failures." I picked up the crumpled paper. "I'll remember, Dad." I went to my room and added another $10 to my boot. I had my birth certificate. I had my Social Security card. I had a mentor waiting for me in Boise. And most importantly, I had the truth. The golden child Caleb was coming home for the weekend to celebrate another football victory. My parents would be distracted by their shrine to his success. That would be my window. That would be the moment I would trade the suffocating silence of Idaho for the roar of my own future. I checked my burner phone under the pillow. One message from Dr. Vance. "The bus arrives at 11 p.m. on Friday. We'll be waiting." The debt was almost settled, and the silent rebellion was about to become a very loud escape. The storm that night was a living thing. It wasn't just rain. It was a violent northwest deluge that turned the Idaho soil into a hungry black mire. The wind shrieked through the pines surrounding the Joan Ranch, a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in a language of pure rage. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the bitter tang of my father's liniment. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't suffocating. I was breathing with the cold, sharp clarity of someone who had already stepped into another world. I stood in the center of the kitchen. the arena of my servitude, and looked at the mahogany table. On it sat a single piece of paper. It wasn't a long letter. I didn't owe them my life story. It simply said, "I found the locked box. I found the scholarship. I am not the daughter you invented. I am the woman you tried to bury. Do not look for me." Beside the note lay my apron, folded neatly like a discarded skin. I looked toward the living room. Caleb was sprawled on the recliner, a shadow of the golden child he used to be. His athletic career hadn't just stalled, it had imploded. A disciplinary issue at the university, a failed drug test, and a series of missed practices had brought him back to the ranch, bitter and demanding. My parents had spent the last month frantically trying to spin his failure as mental exhaustion, while Caleb grew more bloated on their enabling and more aggressive toward me. He didn't see me as a sister. He saw me as the one who was supposed to fix his meals and wash the vomit off his clothes, while he mourned the loss of a spotlight he never truly earned. My parents, Gerald and Martha, were in the study, likely calculating how to use my caregiver status to pull more disability funds or insurance favors. They looked at Caleb with a terrifying, desperate pride, and they looked at me as a permanent fixture of their convenience, a piece of furniture that happened to have a heartbeat. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait for a lull in the wind. I grabbed my worn duffel bag, the one hidden inside a feed sack in the barn, and I walked out the back door. The rain hit me like a physical blow. It was freezing, a biting northwest cold that soaked through my jacket in seconds. My boots sunk into the ruts of the driveway, the same ruts I had spent years clearing and mending. I didn't look back at the lights of the house. I kept my eyes on the darkness ahead. I had 3 miles to trek to the bus station in town, and every step felt like I was breaking a link in a chain that had been forged before I was even born. I reached the McCall bus station just as the rusted blue and gray Greyhound pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the sheets of rain like twin beacons. I fumbled for the cash in my boot, the freedom fund I had built, one stolen dollar at a time. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer, terrifying weight of being free. "Blanche, get your ungrateful hide back in the truck." The roar of my father's engine cut through the wind. I spun around. Their old Ford came skidding into the gravel lot, the headlights blinding me. Gerald jumped out, his cane forgotten in his fury. His chronic back pain magically vanished in the heat of his entitlement. Martha followed, her face a mask of distorted, hysterical rage. "You think you can just leave?" Gerald screamed, stepping into the light. His face was a mottled purple, his eyes bulging. "After everything we've done for you? After we gave you a home when that university called you a failure? You're sick, Blanche. Something is wrong with your head." The words "sick daughter" hit me, echoing the exact words Olivia's father had used on that stormy night 13 years ago. It was the ultimate weapon of the architect, to convince the victim they are the one who is broken. "I'm not sick, Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, carrying over the roar of the bus engine. "I'm just done being your slave." "You're a brat, an ungrateful, disloyal brat," Martha shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made my skin crawl. She lunged forward, trying to grab my arm, her fingers like talons. "Who do you think you are? You're nothing without us. You can't even read a map, let alone survive in a city. You'll be back in a week, begging for a bed." "And I guess I'll be sleeping on the street," I replied, stepping back toward the bus door. "I'll curse the day you were born," Gerald roared, his voice cracking like thunder. "You're an unfilial, cold-hearted traitor. You're leaving your father to die? You're leaving your brother when he's at his lowest? You're the reason this family is falling apart. You're the rot in this house." They stood there in the pouring rain, 2 people who had spent 20 years convincing me I was slow and incapable, just so they wouldn't have to wash their own dishes or face their own failures. They didn't look like parents. They looked like predators who had just realized their prey had grown teeth. I saw Caleb through the truck window. He didn't get out to help them. He just watched, his face full of a sickening, opportunistic fear. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about who was going to make his breakfast tomorrow. "Boarding for Boise," the driver called out, his voice bored and indifferent to the domestic war occurring 10 feet away. I turned my back on them. "Blanche Joan, if you step on that bus, you are dead to us." Martha's voice was a jagged edge. "Do you hear me? Dead. Don't you dare call us when you fail. Don't you dare come crawling back." "I won't," I whispered to the rain. I climbed the steps of the bus. The air inside was warm, smelling of stale coffee and old upholstery. It was the most beautiful smell I had ever encountered. I walked to the very back and sat by the window. As the bus hissed and began to pull away, I looked down at the gravel lot. My parents were standing in the middle of the storm, their figures illuminated by the red glow of the bus's taillights. They were still screaming, their mouths moving in silent, ugly rhythms, their arms flailing against the wind. Gerald was shaking his fist at the retreating metal, and Martha was clutching her chest, already rehearsing the heartbreak she would tell the neighbors about tomorrow. But as the bus gained speed, they began to shrink. The architects of my misery were becoming smaller and smaller, fading into the gray-black curtain of the Idaho rain. Their house, their ranch, their lies, it was all being swallowed by the distance. I reached into my pocket and touched the acceptance letter. It was damp, but the ink was still there. Ms. Blanche Joan. It was a name I finally owned. The bus turned onto the main highway, and the lights of McCall disappeared behind a ridge of pines. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and watched the darkness fly by. The debt was settled. The chains were broken. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the daughter who stayed behind. I was the woman who survived. 5 years in the rugged backcountry of Idaho can change the very shape of the land, shifting the riverbeds and wearing down the ancient pines. But for the Joan Ranch, the last 5 years had been a slow, agonizing rot from the inside out. When I stepped onto that bus in the middle of a northwest deluge, I didn't just leave a house. I left a hollowed-out system of exploitation that was destined to collapse the moment its invisible engine was gone. Without me there to scrub the floors, mend the fences, and absorb the venom, my parents were forced to face the reality they had spent 2 decades trying to avoid. They were incapable of surviving without a victim. The first thing to crumble was the illusion of my father's health. For years, Gerald had used his chronic spinal compression as a scepter of power, a performative ailment that required my constant, unpaid labor to manage. But a strange and bitter irony took hold once I was no longer there to prep his heat packs or lift his dead weight in and out of bed. The fake illness, the one he had weaponized to chain me to his bedside, eventually became a very real, very physical prison. Without my meticulous care and the constant forced exercise I had provided him, his muscles truly began to atrophy. His joints seized up in the brutal Idaho winters, and the spine he had once used as an excuse for his laziness finally, truly betrayed him. He became a man trapped in a recliner, staring out at a ranch he could no longer rule, surrounded by the silence of a daughter who was never coming back. Then there was Caleb, the golden child, whose trophies and accolades were once the only currency that mattered in that house. My parents had poured every ounce of their pride and nearly every cent of their dwindling savings into the black hole of Caleb's potential. But as any architect of misery eventually learns, if you raise a child to believe the world owes them everything while someone else does the work, they will never learn how to build anything for themselves. Caleb's professional track didn't lead to a stadium. It led to a series of expensive failures, legal fees, and a lifestyle he couldn't afford without my parents' enabling. The bankruptcy was swift and merciless. Caleb had burned through the remains of the family's equity, chasing a glory that had evaporated the moment he left high school. When the money ran out, so did Caleb's filial duty. He had watched me be treated like a servant for years and had learned the lesson perfectly. In the Joan family, you only stay as long as you can get something for yourself. The moment he realized there was no more inheritance to be squeezed from the ranch, the golden child did exactly what he had been raised to do. He looked out for himself. He didn't stay to help my father into his wheelchair. He didn't stay to help my mother manage the mounting bills. He packed his designer bags, sold the truck my parents had gone into debt to buy him, and disappeared into the city, leaving them with nothing but the mountain of debt he had created. The ranch itself became a skeletal remain of its former self. The rugged landscape of Idaho, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a tomb. Martha and Gerald were alone, two elderly people trapped in a house that was literally falling apart around them. The fences I once mended were sagging. The roof I once cleared of snow was leaking. They were experiencing the suffocating reality of being caregivers for one another, but without the love or the grace that makes such a life bearable. It was then that the digital performance began. My mother, Martha, who had once stood on a porch and called me a dead traitor, suddenly discovered the power of social media. She realized that if she couldn't use me as a servant, she could use my absence as a way to garner the one thing she craved more than labor: sympathy. The Missing Daughter campaign started slowly. At first, it was just cryptic posts on local McCall community boards. "A mother's heart never stops aching," she would write, accompanied by an old photo of me from high school, a photo where I looked small and tired, the perfect image of a lost child. She didn't mention the intercepted letter. She didn't mention the 3 years of unpaid servitude. She didn't mention the night they threw me out in a storm. She began to weaponize the culture of duty that defined our state, painting a narrative of a sick and confused daughter who had wandered away from a loving home. She posted videos of my father sitting in his wheelchair, looking frail and pathetic, while she sobbed into the camera about how much they needed me to come home. They weren't looking for Blanche the person. They were looking for Blanche the Yithe nurse, Blanche the ranch hand, Blanche the unpaid servant who made their lives comfortable. "We just want to know she's safe," one post read, garnering hundreds of likes and shares from well-meaning strangers who didn't know they were looking for a woman who had finally reclaimed her future from the architects of her misery. "Our family isn't whole without her. Blanche, if you see this, your father's health is failing. Please come home and fulfill your duty." The irony was a cold, sharp blade. For 3 years, they had hidden my acceptance letter to keep me invisible and unambitious. Now they were trying to make me the most visible person in Idaho, using the very filial duty they had used to chain me as a lure to bring me back. They were broadcasting their desperation to the world. But the desperation wasn't born of love. It was born of the fact that the house was cold, the dishes were dirty, and there was no one left to yell at. I watched it all from a distance, through the screen of a laptop in a brightly lit office in Boise. I saw the "Where is Blanche" hashtags and the tearful pleas for my return. I saw the photos of the ranch looking gray and dilapidated, and for a moment, the old cycle of guilt tried to take hold. I felt that familiar, heavy pull in my chest, the feeling that I was a bad child for letting them suffer. But then I looked at the framed diploma on my wall. I looked at the medical journals with my name on the masthead. I remembered the feeling of the frozen gravel against my face and the sound of the oak door clicking shut while I blacked out in the snow. I realized that their chaos wasn't my burden to fix. It was the natural consequence of a lifetime of manipulation and greed. They were the architects of this misery, and they were finally being forced to live in the structure they had built. The golden child had flown, the fake illness had become a real cage, and the daughter they had tried to erase was now the only thing they had left to talk about. But as I closed the tab on my mother's latest missing daughter post, I knew one thing for certain. The woman they were looking for no longer existed. I had been reborn through cold, calculated independence, and no amount of digital guilt or performative tears would ever be enough to make me step back into that Idaho winter again. They were alone with their truth, and for the first time in 20 years, I was finally, truly gone. The standing ovation was still ringing in my ears as I stepped off the stage of the Boise Center. The lights were blinding, and the air in the auditorium felt thick with the collective inspiration of 300 people. But as I moved toward the side exit, the professional mask I had worn for the last 45 minutes began to feel heavy. I knew they were waiting. I could feel the pull of their desperation, a familiar, oily sensation that I had spent a decade trying to scrub from my soul. I stepped into the semi-private corridor leading to the reception hall, and there they were. Gerald and Martha Joan stood huddled near a decorative pine installation, looking like ghosts who had wandered into a world they no longer possessed the currency to inhabit. My mother was clutching a dampened tissue, her eyes red and swollen. My father sat in a motorized wheelchair, a high-end model that I knew they couldn't afford, his hands trembling as they rested on the armrests. Beside them stood Caleb, looking bloated and rumpled in a suit that was too tight, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the wealth of the donors and politicians as if he were looking for something to steal. I stopped 10 feet away, professional distance. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't scowl. I simply stood there, a woman of science and strategy, looking at the people who had tried to erase her. "Blanche, oh, Blanche," my mother sobbed, taking a stumbling step toward me before the security guard I'd hired stepped subtly into her path. She stopped, her hands fluttering to her chest. "We had no idea. We saw the posters, we saw your name on the program, but we didn't believe it." Our little girl, a doctor, a director. "Dr. Joan," I corrected her. My voice was calm, level, the voice I used to deliver a difficult prognosis. "And I haven't been your little girl since the night you told me I was sick and threw me into a storm." My father let out a long, theatrical groan, shifting his weight in the chair. "Blanche, please, look at me. Look at what's become of us." His voice was a gravelly rasp, full of the practiced agony he'd used for 20 years. But this time, the grayness of his skin suggested that the lie had finally become his truth. "The ranch is gone, honey. Caleb, he tried, but the debts and my back, the surgery I need costs more than the land is worth. We're living in a trailer outside of Nampa. A trailer, Blanche." "The roof leaks," Martha added, her voice rising into that sharp, hysterical pitch that used to make my stomach tie in knots. "Every time it rains, I think of you. I think about how we're all alone. Your father needs specialized care, Blanche, 24-hour care. The state-run nurses. They don't care. They're cruel to him. They don't know how to handle his specific needs like you do." I felt a cold, familiar anger begin to stir, but I didn't let it reach my face. The irony was a physical weight in the room. They weren't here to celebrate my success. They weren't here to apologize for the intercepted letter or the 3 years of stolen youth. They were here because their unpaid servant had suddenly become their rich daughter, and they were trying to weaponize the same guilt that had once been my cage. "You're a doctor now," Gerald wheezed, reaching out a shaking hand as if to grab the hem of my blazer. "You took an oath, didn't you? To help the suffering? Your own father is suffering, Blanche. We're your blood. You have this big house in Boise, people say. You have the grants. You have the power." "I have the power because I took it back from you," I said, stepping closer. I looked directly into his eyes, the eyes that had once watched me cry over a rejection they had fabricated. "You talk about filial duty and family unity. But where was that unity when you hid my acceptance letter? Where was the care when you watched me collapse in the snow and told me to get up and cook dinner?" Martha flinched, her tissue shredded in her fingers. "We did that for you. We told you. The world is hard, Blanche. We wanted to keep you safe. We thought if you stayed, we could be a family forever. We were just scared of being alone. No, you loved the convenience I provided, and now that the convenience is gone, and your golden child has failed to provide, you've come to the person you called numb and academic deficient to save you." Caleb finally spoke, his voice full of a sickening, opportunistic arrogance. Come on, Blanche. Look at the optics. You're the director of second chances, right? That's what the big sign says. Don't your own parents deserve a second chance? Think about your reputation. What would your donors think if they knew you let your own father rot in a trailer while you lived in luxury? I turned my gaze to my brother, the star quarterback, the state legend. He looked like a man who had never been told no and was finally realizing the world didn't care about his high school touchdowns. My donors know exactly who I am, Caleb, I said. And more importantly, they know what my program stands for. It's for people who were cast aside, people who were told they were nothing. It's not for the architects who built the prisons. I looked back at my parents. Martha was crying in earnest now, a messy, ugly display of performative grief. Gerald was staring at his feet, his jaw working as if he were trying to find one last lie to sell me. "We have nothing, Blanche," my mother sobbed. "Please, just come home." "I owe you nothing," I said, and the words felt like a final closing stitch on a long, festering wound. "I paid my debt in the 3 years I spent as your slave. I paid it in the snow and the mud and the silence of that ranch. I have spent the last 7 years unlearning every lie you told me about myself. I am not the sick daughter. I am not incapable, and I am certainly not your caregiver." I stepped back, signaling the security guards to move in. "Blanche, you can't do this," Gerald roared, his voice cracking as the wheelchair was slowly turned toward the exit. "We're your parents. You're a Joan. You'll never be rid of us." I watched them being escorted away, the crying woman, the broken man in the chair, and the brother who still thought he could bully his way into a life he didn't earn. They looked small. In the grand, polished marble of the Boise Center, they looked like the insignificant predators they had always been. The tension in my chest finally began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. They thought this was the end of the conversation. They thought their tears were the final move. They didn't realize that the payoff I had planned wasn't just about refusing to help. It was about the truth. And tomorrow, when the news of my foundation's latest scholarship hits the papers, I'm going to make sure the state of Idaho knows exactly why the director of Second Chances has no room in her life for the people who tried to steal her first one. I adjusted my blazer, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and walked back into the ballroom. The meeting was over. But the reckoning was just beginning. The bright, sterile lights of the Boise Center ballroom felt like an interrogation. For 20 minutes, I had stood at this mahogany podium, answering questions from the local press about the Second Chances Initiative, a program designed to provide medical pathways for those who had been cast aside by the systems that were supposed to protect them. Through the crowd of reporters and flashing cameras, I saw them. My parents, Gerald and Martha, were sitting in the very front row now. They had managed to squeeze their way through the VIP entrance, wearing expressions of practiced, tearful pride. They looked like the perfect, supportive parents of a successful doctor. Behind them, Caleb sat slumped, his eyes darting toward the cameras as if he were trying to calculate how much this reunion would be worth in a tabloid headline. A reporter from the Idaho Statesman stood up. "Dr. Joan, you speak a lot about second chances for those who are invisible. What was the catalyst for this? Was there a specific moment you realized that potential was being suppressed in rural Idaho?" I looked at the reporter. Then, I looked directly at my father. I felt the weight of the yellowed envelope in my blazer pocket, the paper trail of a betrayal that had lasted 1,000 days. "Yes," I said. My voice was amplified, echoing off the gilded ceilings. There was a moment, but it wasn't a policy change, and it wasn't a budget cut. It was a theft. A hush fell over the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. The paper was worn at the edges, stained with the dust of the study where it had been hidden behind a locked cabinet for 3 years. I held it up so the cameras could catch the University of Washington seal. "This," I said, my voice dropping into a register of cold, sharp clarity, is an acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country. It is dated April 14th, 7 years ago. I saw my mother flinch. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes widening as she realized the mask of the grieving mother was about to be stripped away in front of the entire state. When this letter arrived, I continued, I was 19 years old. I was working 14 hours a day on a ranch, scrubbing floors, drenching cattle, and acting as a full-time, unpaid youth nurse for a man who claimed his spine was too shattered to walk. It was strong enough to hide my future in a locked drawer. The whispers began in the back of the room. I didn't stop. I opened the envelope, the sound of the crinkling paper loud in the silence. My parents told me this school had rejected me, I said, looking at Gerald. They told me I was academic deficient. They told me I wasn't enough to be a doctor, and that my only true duty was to stay behind and care for them because they were the only ones who would ever want me. They weaponized my guilt to chain me to their bedsides as an unpaid servant, convincing me that the world had found me wanting, while they held the proof of my success in their hands. Blanche, please. Martha's voice was a weak, trembling plea from the front row. This isn't the place. This is exactly the place, I snapped, the 3 years of silenced rage finally finding its edge. Because for 3 years, you used the facade of filial duty to justify domestic exploitation. You didn't hide this letter to protect me from failure. You hid it to protect your own convenience. You were the architects of my misery, and you built your comfort on the ruins of my dreams. I turned the letter around, pointing to the bottom of the scholarship page. My father didn't just hide this, I told the cameras, the flashes intensifying. He forged my signature on a document declining a full-ride scholarship. He told the university I was staying in Idaho due to family obligations. He signed away my life with the same indifference he used to order a bag of feed. Gerald stood up, his face a mottled, angry purple. I did what was best for the family. You were a girl. You were needed at home. We raised you. We gave you everything. You gave me a shovel and a list of chores, I replied, my voice slicing through his roar like a scalpel. You didn't raise a daughter. You cultivated a resource. And when that resource tried to grow beyond your fence, you tried to cut it down. I leaned into the microphone, my eyes never leaving theirs. I want everyone in this room to understand something, I said, the words heavy with a decade of unlearning their lies. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't protecting a fragile child. This was the cold, calculated appropriation of a human being's life. This was slave-like servitude under the guise of family, and it is a crime that happens in the shadows of duty every single day. The payoff wasn't the gasps from the reporters. It wasn't even the way the cameras pivoted away from me and toward the 3 people who were now shrinking in their seats. The payoff was the look in my father's eyes, the realization that his unpaid servant was now the one holding the records. You called me sick the night you threw me out into a storm because I finally found the truth, I said, referencing the trauma that had almost erased me. But as I stand here today, a doctor and a director, I realized that I was never the one who was sick. The rot was always in the house. The rot was always in the architects. I folded the letter and placed it back on the podium. My foundation is named Second Chances because I had to fight for mine, I concluded, my heart beating with a rhythmic final piece. I am reclaiming my future from the people who tried to steal it. And to my parents, I have only this to say. The labor is over. The debt you claimed I owed you, it was paid in full the moment I stepped onto that bus and left you alone with your lies. I stepped back from the microphone. The room erupted, not into applause, but into a frantic, chaotic scramble as reporters descended on Gerald and Martha, demanding answers for the paper trail of betrayal I had just laid bare. I walked off the stage, my head held high, the northwest wind of Idaho no longer feeling like a threat. I had peeled back the facade. I had told the truth. And as I passed the security guards who were now escorting my family out of the building, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was finally, truly real. The silence that followed my public reveal didn't last. It was quickly replaced by a frantic, buzzing chaos as the reporters in the Boise Center scrambled for a headline. But in the small, carpeted alcove where my parents had been cornered by the security team, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of old resentment and the desperate, sharp scent of Martha's perfume. They stood there, two people who had spent a decade convincing themselves of their own lies. Now, faced with the physical proof of their betrayal, that yellowed, intercepted letter, the foundation of their control was finally crumbling. "How could you do this, Gerald?" Martha's voice was a jagged whisper, her eyes wide with a panicked, opportunistic terror. She turned on my father, her hands clawing at his sleeve. "I told you we should have burned it. I told you she'd find it eventually. This is your fault. Your arrogance has ruined us." Gerald didn't look at her. His face was a mottled, angry purple, the veins in his neck bulging like thick cords. "My fault? You were the one who insisted she stay. You were the one who said we couldn't handle the ranch without her. You played the martyr, Martha. You enjoyed having a servant more than I did." "I did it for the family," she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that drew the attention of the nearby staff. "I did it because she was fragile, because she wasn't built for the world. I was protecting her from the humiliation of failing." I watched them from 3 feet away, my face a mask of cold, calculated distance. It was a scene I had witnessed 1,000 times in the shadows of the ranch. The architects of my misery turning on one another the moment the structure they built began to lean. For years, they had been a united front of suppression. But now, stripped of their power, they were nothing more than 2 bitter strangers trying to find someone else to carry the weight of their shame. "Enough," I said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through their bickering like a scalpel. They both froze, looking at me with a mixture of fear and a sickening, lingering hope that I might still be the daughter they could manipulate. "Blanche, sweetheart," my mother began, her voice dropping into that soft, poisonous caress she used when she wanted something. "You have to understand. The world out there, it's not what you think. We saw how you struggled. We saw your limitations. We were just trying to give you a purpose, a real purpose, here at home, with the people who love you. It was for your own good. We didn't want to see you get hurt by people who wouldn't understand you." "You didn't want to see me get hurt?" I asked, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. "You watched me black out in the snow. You watched me cry over a rejection you fabricated. You didn't want to protect me, Martha. You wanted to preserve your comfort. You didn't see a daughter. You saw a resource. You weaponized my guilt to chain me to your bedside, and you called it love, so you wouldn't have to call it theft." "You're being cruel," Gerald wheezed, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes narrowed in a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. "After everything we gave you, the roof over your head, the food on your table, you think you're so high and mighty now with your fancy title. You're still a Joan. You're still the girl who couldn't even read a map without help. I am the woman who built a multi-million-dollar initiative while you were busy trying to remember where you hid my life," I replied. I felt a surge of cold, calculated independence that finally eclipsed the last of my childhood fears. "I have spent 10 years unlearning the version of myself that you invented. I am not sick. I am not incapable. And I am certainly no longer your unpaid caregiver." I turned my back on them, ignoring my mother's renewed sobs and my father's muffled curses. I walked back toward the podium, the clicking of my heels on the marble floor sounding like the final notes of a funeral march for my past. The cameras were still there, the reporters waiting with pens poised, sensing that the present-day payoff was about to reach its peak. I adjusted the microphone. The room fell into a hush so profound I could hear the wind rattling the high windows of the Boise Center. "Today," I began, my voice clear and resonant, amplified across the hall, You have seen the physical evidence of what happens when the people who are supposed to be your anchors become your chains. My story is not unique. Across this state, in the most remote corners of our rugged landscape, there are others, young men and women whose potential is being stifled by the very people tasked with nurturing it. They are trapped in a false duty trap, told that their independence is a betrayal and their dreams are a sickness. I look directly into the lens of the main television camera. I am here to announce that, starting today, the Joan legacy of suppression is over. My foundation is launching a new initiative, the Second Chances Scholarship Fund. This fund is specifically designed for victims of domestic exploitation and family abuse, those who, like me, were told they were not enough, so that they would stay and serve. A ripple of applause began in the back of the room, growing into a steady roar. This scholarship will provide more than just tuition, I continued, my heart beating with a rhythmic, final piece. It will provide legal aid to reclaim stolen identities, counseling to unlearn the psychological manipulation of toxic parents, and a bridge to the independence that was stolen from them. We will peel back the facade of filial duty and expose it for what it truly is when it lacks love, a prison. I saw my parents being led toward the exit by the security team. They looked small, insignificant. They were no longer the architects of my misery. They were merely the inspiration for a future they would never be a part of. To anyone listening who feels invisible, I concluded, my eyes bright with the truth, know this: rejection by those who should have loved you is not the end. It is a beginning. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. It is determined by the life you build after you leave the storm behind. As the standing ovation erupted, I stepped away from the podium. I didn't look at row 4. I didn't look for the golden child or the parents who had tried to erase me. I walked toward the exit, toward Dr. Vance and the team who had chosen me when my own family walked away. The debt was settled. The aftermath was clear. I was no longer the daughter who stayed. I was the woman who had finally, truly, come home to herself. The silence in the private breakout room of the Boise Center was heavier than the storm outside. The high-gloss mahogany table between us felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. On one side sat Dr. Blanche Joan, a woman who had reclaimed her name, her intellect, and her future. On the other side sat Gerald and Martha Joan, looking like a pair of weathered, discarded tools from a ranch they no longer owned. My father was hunched in his motorized chair, the hum of the battery the only sound in the room. His hands, once strong enough to drag me back from the door, were now skeletal and trembling as they gripped the armrests. My mother sat beside him, her face a map of ruin, clutching a designer handbag that was likely the last valuable thing she possessed. They had been cornered by the truth I had just laid bare on the auditorium stage, and now, stripped of their masks, they were playing their final, most desperate card, the victim's plea. "Blanche, please," my mother whispered, her voice cracking with a practiced saccharine sorrow. "We saw the news. We saw the foundation's budget. You're a millionaire, honey. And look at us. We're living in a 12-foot trailer behind a salvage yard in Nampa. The winter is coming. And your father. He needs a surgery that the state won't cover. They say it's elective. Elective! As if being able to walk is a choice." I didn't blink. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table. For 10 years, I had imagined this moment, the moment they would realize I was the one with the power. But I didn't feel the rush of revenge I had expected. I felt a profound, clinical distance. I was looking at them the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, something to be identified, assessed, and removed. "The medical bills are $40,000, Blanche," Gerald wheezed, his eyes darting to my face, searching for a flicker of the fragile daughter he had spent 20 years inventing. $40,000. That's a rounding error for your foundation. If we don't pay the back rent on the trailer lot, we'll be on the street by November. You're a doctor. You took an oath to help people. How can you stand there in your $1,000 suit and watch your own father rot." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm and level, the voice of a woman who had spent years unlearning the version of herself they had created in the dark. "You talk about an oath, Gerald," I said, the name feeling like a cold stone in my mouth. "But you forget that an oath is a two-way street. A doctor's duty is to heal, not to facilitate the comfort of those who thrive on destruction. You aren't asking for my help. You're asking for a payout. You're trying to bill me for the childhood you stole." "We raised you," Martha shrieked, her voice reaching that sharp, hysterical pitch that used to make me flinch. "We gave you everything. We kept you safe when the world told you that you weren't good enough. We sacrificed our lives to make sure you had a home." "No," I replied, the words slicing through her hysterics like a scalpel. "You didn't keep me safe. You kept me invisible. You didn't sacrifice your lives. You sacrificed mine. You hid my acceptance letter so you wouldn't have to pay for a ETH nurse. You forged my signature to decline a scholarship so you wouldn't have to wash your own dishes. You didn't give me a home. You gave me a cage and called it filial duty." I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a ledger I had prepared with the help of a private investigator and a forensic accountant. "I did the math," I said, sliding the paper across the mahogany. 3 years of 24-hour caregiver labor. Minimum wage for an unlicensed nurse in the state of Idaho during those years was $18 an hour. That's $432 a day. Over 3 years, that's $473,000. That doesn't include the ranch labor, the cleaning, or the grocery skimming you accused me of when I was actually just trying to buy a bus ticket." My father looked at the number, his jaw working in a desperate attempt to find a rebuttal. "I have already contributed more to your retirement than most children do in a lifetime," I continued, my heart beating with a rhythmic final piece. "You didn't lose that money to the bank. You spent it on Caleb's failures and your own greed, all while I was blacking out in the snow clearing your driveway. You don't want a daughter. You want a bank account you can bully." "Blanche, please," my mother sobbed, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I moved my hand away. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of hygiene. "I am the director of Second Chances," I said, looking her directly in the eyes, "but my foundation has a very strict policy. We help the survivors, not the architects of the misery. To help you would be to betray every student I've ever awarded a scholarship to. It would be telling them that their abusers can eventually win if they just wait long enough for the victim to become successful." I stood up, adjusting my blazer. The meeting was over. The boundaries were no longer invisible. They were reinforced concrete. "I am not going to give you $40,000, I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "I am not going to pay for your surgery, and I am not going to save your trailer. You have a son whom you called Golden. Perhaps he can help you with the values you taught him." Gerald's face turned a mottled, ugly purple. "You're cold, Blanche. You're a monster. You're exactly what we said you were. Sick. You're a sick, heartless woman." I smiled then, a genuine, beautiful smile of a woman who was finally, truly free. "I'm not sick, Gerald," I said. "I'm just finished. I have finished paying the debt of blood and bone with 3 years of literal slavery. I have fulfilled every imagined obligation you ever tried to chain me with. I have paid for my birth, my food, and my shelter with the sweat and the spirit you tried to crush." I walked to the door and opened it, signaling the security team waiting in the hall. "From this moment on," I said, turning back to them one last time, "we are strangers. Do not call my office. Do not post your performative tears on my foundation's page. Do not send me Christmas cards with no return address. In my world, you don't exist. You are just 2 people I once knew, and I have already mourned you." "Blanche, you can't do this. We're your family." Martha's voice followed me as I stepped into the hall. "No," I whispered to the empty air as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. "Family is choice, and I choose to be free. I walked down the long, sunlit corridor of the Boise Center, the clicking of my heels a triumphant, percussive rhythm against the marble. The architects of my misery were locked in a room they could no longer control, left alone with the silence of their own greed. I stepped out into the crisp Idaho air, took a deep breath of the pine-scented wind, and realized that for the first time in 28 years, the debt was settled, and I didn't owe the world a single thing. The sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Sawtooth Mountains, painting the Idaho sky in bruises of violet and gold. I stood on the wraparound porch of my new home, not a cabin built of rotting timber and secrets, but a house of glass, stone, and light. The air here, high above the valley, was thin and pure. It didn't smell like diesel or old resentment. It smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and the terrifying, beautiful scent of a fresh start. I wrapped my hands around a ceramic mug. The warmth seeped into my fingers that were no longer raw from lie or trembling from the weight of a father who refused to walk. In the distance, the mountains stood like silent sentinels. For 20 years, I had looked at those same peaks from the window of the ranch and felt they were the walls of a prison. Today, they were just a view, a magnificent, indifferent view that belonged to no one but the earth itself. Inside the house, the quiet was intentional. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a household waiting for the next outburst or the next crisis. It was the peaceful hum of a life built on my own terms. On the mantel sat a small, simple frame. It didn't hold a trophy or a staged family photo. It held the yellowed, crinkled acceptance letter from the University of Washington, the one Gerald had hidden in a locked drawer for 3 years. I kept it not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as a trophy of what I had survived. It was the physical proof that the architects of my misery had failed. They had tried to bury the truth, but the truth had a patient way of outgrowing the dirt. I thought about the gala in Boise, the way my mother's mascara had run as she begged for a second chance that she hadn't earned. I thought about Caleb, the golden child who had finally realized that a crown built on someone else's labor eventually turns to lead. People had asked me if I felt a sense of revenge when I revealed their deception to the world. But standing here, watching the light catch the frost on the meadow, I realized that revenge was too small a word for this feeling. Revenge is about them. This was about me. I had spent a decade unlearning the version of myself they had invented, the slow one, the sick daughter, the one who was too academic deficient to survive the world. I had realized that their labels weren't descriptions of my character. They were tools of my trade. They needed me to be small so they could feel big. They needed me to be incapable so they never had to be independent. The internal shift from feeling like a bad child to realizing I was a victim of domestic exploitation had been the hardest surgery I ever performed on myself. It required cutting away the false duty trap that had been sutured into my heart since I was a girl. It meant accepting that family isn't always biology. Sometimes it's choice. My phone buzzed on the cedar table. A text from Dr. Vance. The first round of Second Chances scholarships has been finalized. 10 students, Blanche. 10 lives that won't have to wait as long as you did. I smiled, a genuine, deep-seated warmth spreading through my chest. The scholarship program wasn't born from anger. It was born from purpose. It was about turning my pain into a bridge for others who were still trapped in the shadows of filial duty. I had learned that my worth wasn't determined by the people who failed to see it. It was determined by the 83 students we had already helped stay in school, stay alive, and stay hopeful. I looked out at the valley below. Somewhere down there, in a trailer park or a rented room, Gerald and Martha were likely still telling their story, the story of the ungrateful daughter who abandoned them. I realized then that I no longer cared what they said. Their words were like the wind. They could howl all they wanted, but they could no longer move the mountains I had built. The boundaries I had set weren't walls to keep them out. They were doors that I finally controlled. For For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a letter. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. A hawk circled high above the sawtooths, catching an updraft and soaring effortlessly toward the sun. I watched it until it was just a speck against the blue. "I'm free," I whispered to the morning. The words didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt light. They felt like the end of a long, cold Idaho winter. I took a sip of my coffee and turned back toward the house. My house. The breakfast table was set for one, and for the first time, the empty chairs didn't feel like a lack. They felt like space. Space to grow. Space to breathe. Space to be exactly who I was always meant to be. My name is Dr. Blanche Joan. I am 32 years old, and I am no longer an unpaid servant. I am a survivor, a healer, and the sole architect of my own future. The debt is settled, the chains are gone, and the only duty I have left is to the woman I saw in the mirror, the one who refused to let her light be dimmed. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The click of the lock didn't sound like a prison anymore. It sounded like home.